Throughout his career, J.R.R. Tolkien drew upon an unusually broad set of influences, from Anglo-Saxon poetry to Shakespeare, to histories of the medieval period, from Sigurd to Beowulf to Kullervo, from the pantheon of the classical world to the myths of the Celtic, from his studies of philology and linguistics to archaeology and antiquarianism, from stories of King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot to the works of Charles Dickens and George MacDonald and William Morris. He takes all of these influences, and so many more besides, and combines them alchemically, magically, into a world that is all at once deeply familiar and also completely new. And in the years that followed, so convincing was his vision of this type of fantasy that it's almost impossible to overstate his influence. There is a change in era with the publication of The Lord of the Rings, and to a lesser extent, The Hobbit too. Entire careers, entire subgenres have been constructed from the template Tolkien laid out, echoing many of the same big ideas, replicating many of the same details. It is no exaggeration to say that modern Western fantasy, from the $15 billion industry that is Dungeons & Dragons to the pop culture phenomenon of Game of Thrones, is at least in large part the house that Tolkien built. But for readers of fantasy literature, there's one particular element of Tolkien's work that is even more familiar, more prevalent, more ubiquitous than magic rings and wise old wizards and reforged swords. And what's remarkable is that this element appears before we even begin the story, before the hole in the ground wherein lives a hobbit, before Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announces his 111st birthday. And this mysterious element is arguably more evocative than either, more enticing. Because before we get to the first word of the story, if you are anything like me, you've already spent a lot of time studying the map. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, as we begin our journey together through Middle-earth and all of Tolkien's work, I thought we should begin by studying the maps and figuring out, roughly at least, where we're going. First, though, perhaps a quick word of explanation, of introduction. I'm Alistair, and I'm an enthusiastic amateur scholar of the works of Professor Tolkien, and Shire Reckoning is my opportunity to take a topic-based approach to the breadth and the depth of his secondary creation. Some weeks I will offer a lecture on a particular subject, large or small. Some weeks I'll offer an opinion or build an argument about some unresolved or contentious issue. Some weeks I might review a particular book or movie, or maybe even episodes of some kind of big-budget TV adaptation, should such a thing ever exist. Every week will be different, but our spirit of positive and generous inquiry is going to be constant. I hope that you enjoy the show, and if you have topics you would like me to cover in this opening segment, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. So J.R.R. Tolkien wasn't the first fantasy author to include a map in his book. L. Frank Baum drew a map to accompany the 8th book in the Oz series, TikTok of Oz, which was published in 1914. Robert E. Howard included a hand-drawn map of the Hyborian Age in his Conan stories in 1932, and it looks very similar to the kinds of maps we still see today. There are many older examples, too, but the definitions of what we mean by fantasy fiction start to get a little soft the further back in time you go. Treasure Island, okay. Gulliver's Travels, well, maybe. Thomas Hardy's Wessex, maybe not so much. Which is not to say that I don't love both the fiction of and the map containing Thomas Hardy's Wessex. So Tolkien isn't breaking new ground with the publication of The Hobbit in 1936, not in terms of the maps anyway, but he is both elevating the art form and integrating it into his story in a more complete way than any previous author. Not only does Thror's map in The Hobbit appear in the actual story, it is a diegetic artifact recreated for the reader, but it's remarkably dense in terms of how it presents Tolkien's world-building. It isn't just informative, it is also narrative. The inclusion of the Futhorc runes on the left-hand side and the moon letters, which will become visible when the map is studied in Rivendell, both the product of and the making of prophecy. The entire map is turned 90 degrees counterclockwise from what we might expect by modern cartographic standards, putting east at the top and north on the left-hand edge. And you don't have to read the runes on the compass rose to learn that. You just have to note the east to the Iron Hills text at the top of the page, the arrow to the north marked by the Great Worm, and at the bottom of the page, the brilliantly ominous west lies Mirkwood the Great. There are spiders. It is so completely a product of its own fictional creation, like so much of Tolkien's work, that it invites the investment of our belief. Maps are important. So important, in fact, that one of the first things we learn about Bilbo Baggins in the pages of The Hobbit is that he too loves maps, though they are, like so many parts of the Shire, safe and cozy and largely oriented around leisure. Unlike the imperial cartographers of Britain in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Shire folk see no value in the white space at the edge of the map. They see no need for conquest of expansion, no terra incognita to be exploited. A map, for Bilbo, is a guide to a place that is already well loved. Christopher Tolkien receives, and deserves, a great deal of praise for his execution of his father's cartographic vision. The maps in The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion are completely redrawn by Christopher and are works of art in their own right. In fact, since we're talking in part about the influence of these maps in the years following the publication, in particular of The Lord of the Rings, I should absolutely acknowledge that Christopher's painstakingly lovely pen and ink style is at least as influential on the fantasy authors of the last 75 years as any other element of his father's work. I will link in the show notes to an article by Jonathan Crow entitled Celebrating Christopher Tolkien's Cartographic Legacy, which was published shortly after Christopher's death in 2020. Letter 144, written by Tolkien to the Scottish novelist Naomi Mitchison in 1954, months before the actual publication of The Fellowship of the Ring, is one of my favorites of Tolkien's letters. It is oddly candid and wide-ranging, and touches on the unlikely publication of the Silmarillion and the languages of Middle-earth and the history of elves and Entwives, and includes an apology for the lack of maps in the proofreader version that Mitchison had read. We get this lovely passage in which Tolkien is reassuring Mitchison about the maps that will be printed in the final version. Quote, "I wisely started with a map, and made the story fit generally with meticulous care for distances. The other way about lands one in confusions and impossibilities, and in any case it is weary work to compose a map from a story." End quote. And I should add here, in case you no longer remember the Twitter of 2019, that, quote, "I wisely started with a map," was the first swing in the media campaign promoting the Amazon TV show Rings of Power, which, and I guess this makes my argument about the importance of cartography to Tolkien's world, began by posting maps, rewinding time, moving the narrative back to the Second Age, and introducing, to most readers at least, Numenor. These maps were designed by artist John Howe and Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey, and I think the general consensus is that they did a pretty good job with only a few controversial choices. But Tolkien's maps are more than just narrative logistics. They're more than just geography. They betray at every turn what Tolkien considers important, what matters in Middle-earth. Books always teach you how to read them by showing you what is important, by showing you how things are to be understood, where your attention should be focused, and to what extent you're going to be expected to piece the story together yourself or have it delivered to you. The beginnings of both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, especially if you skip over the prefatory texts, the forewords and the prologues and the notes from the author on the second edition, those beginnings are masterclasses in addressing the reader and guiding the reader into the experience of the story. But because Tolkien thought so deeply about every aspect of his work, that introductory experience, that primer on how to read this story, extends beyond the narrative itself and absolutely begins with the map. A glance at either the original maps included in the text or later redrawn clarified versions from other sources, I will direct you here to lotrproject.com, the link is in the show notes, for their fantastic scrollable, zoomable maps of Middle-earth and Beleriand. A glance at the maps of Middle-earth reveals the most significant geographical feature to be, as we might expect, mountains. The West and the Wild are demarcated by the Misty Mountains. Mordor is encircled and bisected by mountains of ash and shadow. Middle-earth is sheltered on the western side by the Ered Luin, beyond which lays vanished Beleriand and the Great Sea. The map is segmented by these mountains, which match their narrative significance. Erebor and Carathras and Orodruin, and the passage of Aragorn through the paths of the dead, through the White Mountains to Erech and Gondor proper, necessary, of course, for the greatest moment of eucatastrophe in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. This is explicitly narrative in The Hobbit, for which much of the map was created, with the journey from the hill to the mountain, with the Misty Mountains serving both as the natural boundary between and housing the thematic threshold that Bilbo crosses by besting Gollum and claiming the ring. This is geography as narrative, but it's also geography as ideology. What Tolkien chooses to include on the maps demonstrates what he believes to be important. Beyond the mountains, we have rivers and forests, natural boundaries, but not, importantly, national boundaries. There are no modern, sharply defined borders between nation-states. In this way, of course, Tolkien is acknowledging his own medievalism, the influence of that time and those kinds of maps. But he's also illustrating the political reality of Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age. If there's a border, it's likely to run along a river or trace the edge of a forest. It is likely to be at least as descriptive as it is prescriptive. If no such natural feature exists, then there is going to be a soft, porous, ambiguous border, just as such borders were in real life prior to the advent of the modern nation-state and military cartography. Even Rohan, which is the closest thing we have to a defined created space, this empty Gondorian province ravaged by plague that is won by Ravanian horsemen driving out Dunlandings, even Rohan is bordered on the east side by the Meering stream, which runs down from the White Mountains. Even internally, Gondor's borders are natural. And all of this is important as we track in our worn paperback copies the journey of the Fellowship, or Thorin's company. There's a real pleasure, for me at least, in tracking the circuitous route that the hobbits and Aragorn take from Bree to Weathertop, and there's something resonant in following their swift passage down the Anduin, past the Gladden fields where the ring was lost when Isildur fell, and then tracking their journey to the Falls of Rauros. As an accompaniment to the reading experience, the maps are fantastically valuable. But perhaps the most important contribution of Tolkien's maps to the reading experience can be found away from the narrative path, away from the East Road and from Rivendell, away from the Misty Mountains and the Anduin. Carn Dûm, for example, is mentioned twice in the text of The Lord of the Rings, and there it is on the map. The same can be said of Lake Evendim. The Ered Mithrin and Mount Gundabad are only mentioned in Appendix A, but there they are on the map. We don't know anything about Dol Amroth except that Prince Imrahil is awesome, but there it is on the map. And add to that the romance of roads which are now incomplete, of kingdoms which are fallen, of the weight of history visible on the landscape depicted in front of us. This specificity contributes both directly and indirectly to what Tolkien called the impression of depth, the aesthetic effect that convinces the reader that the work extends beyond the limits of the page and is therefore more compelling, more authentic. In letter 247, he describes this effect as being, quote, an attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. And it's the map that gives us most directly these glimpses of distant cities and unvisited islands. And all of this, I think, is undeniably part of the chief appeal of The Lord of the Rings, this sense that everything is three-dimensional and possesses its own identity and history. And perhaps nowhere in the text is this realized more fully, more effortlessly than in the maps. And not least of all, of course, because maps, even in their most prosaic real-life sense, are things inherently magical to those predisposed to adventure. In a broader sense, the maps that we see in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings and in the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales and the Book of Lost Tales and all the way through the History of Middle-earth series, all these maps represent the greatest strengths of Tolkien's work: depth, complexity, and a rigorous attention to detail. These are, in that aforementioned broader sense, the things that keep us reading Tolkien's work, that keep me coming back to these books after decades of appreciating them, that keep us adapting and retelling and analyzing these stories, that keep us enchanted with Middle-earth. Normally, in this second segment of the show, I am going to take some listener questions and emails and give out some updates on the production schedule and my plans here on Shire Reckoning, but this is the first episode, so I have no listener questions, I have no emails, I have, frankly, only the sketchiest of plans. So if you have questions or comments or thoughts or ideas on any part of the Legendarium, if there are topics that you would like me to address, then please get in touch, either via the Shire Messenger service and email at shirereckoningpod@gmail.com, or by leaving a YouTube comment or saying hi on Blue Sky or Instagram. All the links to all the places are in the show notes. And if you've looked at some of the social media pages or you've read the description attached to this podcast in your app of choice, then you might have noticed that Shire Reckoning is described as a twice-weekly podcast. One episode just like this will come out every Sunday, starting with that brief lecture or editorial or opinion piece, followed by some Q&A and community updates, and closing out with a mysterious third segment that we'll get to in due course. But that's not the whole Shire Reckoning experience. because we're really here to share our love of the books. So every Tuesday evening at 9 p.m. Central Time, I'm going to host an hour of discussion and analysis live on YouTube. If you are familiar with my previous work or with my genre fiction show Stars and Swords, then you know what to expect. It will be a fun, positive analysis of the text on the page and the big ideas behind that text. We're going to begin by adopting a reading strategy that I have never tried before, which is very exciting. Over on the aforementioned Stars and Swords, the link to which is in the show notes, I've spent the last 6 months studying the Silmarillion and tracing the history of the oldest stories in the Legendarium, the foundational texts. So for our first reading together here on Shire Reckoning, I want to take all of that history and carry it with us into a reading of The Hobbit. Not a naive introductory reading of The Hobbit, but an attempt to understand how this Hobbit-sized story is situated in a landscape that Tolkien has already spent more than a decade filling with myths and history before he begins the tale of Bilbo Baggins. And the story of how we get from the famous account of Tolkien's spontaneous moment of subcreation when faced with a blank page to the publication of the second edition, just prior to The Lord of the Rings, will occupy our first live session this coming Tuesday. So, to join me live, well, I guess I have to introduce the means by which this podcast sustains itself. I don't run ads on this show, and I never will, because ads are a blight on the internet. Everything I do is funded by you, the listener, so allow me to introduce you to, drumroll please, patreon.com/nextword. Nextword is the umbrella name for all of the podcasts that I produce, either solo or with my partner, the brilliant Elizabeth Ray. Over at Nextword, we've produced a full-length podcast series called The Last Star in Hollywood, where we studied in depth every single film in the Tom Cruise filmography, trying to figure out what makes such a deeply strange and controversial figure so compelling. That show is currently on hiatus after our final, almost 2-hour-long discussion of Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, but we will pick it up whenever Cruise releases something new. You will also find Don't You Know Me By Now, a meandering stroll through Richard Linklater's Before trilogy, the 3 films starring Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy. We have done 20 episodes so far, I think, and we've just finished the second of the 3 films, so now is the perfect time to catch up and join us for the discussion of the 2013 movie Before Midnight. Nextword is also home to the aforementioned Stars and Swords, footnoting genre fiction, which is basically me doing this to books not written by J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, mostly not written by J.R.R. Tolkien. As I said, I spent the last 6 months covering the Silmarillion, and we just finished the Quenta Silmarillion as of this recording, so we are moving forward with purpose into the Akalabeath. So if you want to hear 40 hours of discussion, only about a third of which is dedicated to Tukas, the Best of the Valar, then head on over to Stars and Swords, where I have also covered, wow, can I do this from memory? I have covered The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Prince Caspian. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader will come at the end of this year. I also covered Terry Miles's Rabbits, based on the podcast of the same name. I covered V.E. Schwab's brilliant The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Catherine Kerr's fantasy classic Dagger Spell, Nnedi Okorafor's compelling African futurist work, the Binti Trilogy, and the first 2 trade paperbacks of Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man series. I covered Bram Stoker's Dracula and Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. I think that is all of them. So those are all the other podcasts that I produce, and they are all supported by that Nextword Patreon. But that's not why I'm bringing it up now. To get access to the live discussions here on Shire Reckoning, to join me in the YouTube chat every Tuesday evening, then all you have to do is sign up to follow Nextword on Patreon for free. It doesn't cost a penny. It is just an easy way of putting a little sign on the gate and making sure that only those on party business are admitted without throwing open the doors of Bag End for the full torrent of the internet. So follow patreon.com/nextword for free and get the link every Tuesday to the live session at 9 p.m. Central Time. That is 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific, 2 a.m. UTC, I believe. And if you choose to pledge a little financial support at patreon.com/nextword, then 2 things are true. First, you are very directly helping me make these shows. I get better recording equipment, better studio gear, more books, more electricity, more coffee, all the essentials of life. But you also get access to a bushel full of bonus episodes, including a weekly show that I'm going to do right after the live session every Tuesday, a Shire Reckoning after show in which we can take the time to chat more casually and follow some of the more surprising tangents that inevitably arise from the live discussion. It's going to be a cozy little after-hours club, a little lock-in at the Green Dragon, and I'm really looking forward to it. I will also highlight a show called Made It Through Monday, a weekly bonus podcast hosted with Elizabeth Ray, in which we talk a little about what's going on in our lives and discuss the media we have been recently enjoying. This week's episode will feature an in-depth discussion of Ryan Coogler's smash hit vampire movie, Sinners. So, all of that, I know, is a lot, but no one said that launching a new Tolkien podcast or listening to a new Tolkien podcast would be easy, and I am proud of both of us for making it this far. Bullet points then. Send your questions and your comments to shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. Follow and support patreon.com/nextword. And please take a moment right now to rate and review this podcast wherever you found it, and to help others find out about the work that we are doing here. And a sincere, grateful thank you for your support and for listening to this first episode. This has been a dream for a long time, and I'm so glad to finally be beginning this new journey. And all of that brings us here to the journey home, the downhill stroll, the third segment. This is where I am going to cover some stories and announcements coming out of Tolkien fandom and academia, highlighting curiosities and objects of interest which have happened in the last week or are in any way connected to the professor and his work. This week, by Shire reckoning, is a fairly quiet one in Arda. Not a lot happens in the summer months, but things are going to pick up by the time we get to September. This week is notable for Boromir just starting his long solo journey to Rivendell, inspired by Faramir's dream. I mean, Boromir's dream. Absolutely Boromir's dream. No one has ever dreamed better or more vividly than Boromir. Seek for the sword that was broken. In Imladris it dwells. There shall be counsels taken, stronger than Morgul's spells. There shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand, for Isildur's bane shall waken, and the halfling forth shall stand. Boromir sets out on July 4th, and it will take him 110 days to make it all the way to Rivendell. Someday I'm going to sit down and properly figure out his likely route and timeline, but for now it's pretty clear he begins by heading west to Edoras. A far more significant event, of course, occurred on July 10th in the year 1418 by Shire reckoning, when Gandalf is imprisoned by Saruman on the pinnacle of the Tower of Orthanc in Isengard, when Saruman reveals himself to be Saruman of many colours, duplicitous and treacherous, and we get one of my favourite lines from Gandalf, quote, "He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom." Gandalf will remain imprisoned atop Orthanc for 2 months as the Nine move in the world, and the threat grows ever greater, but both of these threads, interestingly both Gandalf and Boromir, will come together at the Council of Elrond. In the week ahead, skipping ahead to the year 1419 and the aftermath of the War of the Ring, we have the feast in Minas Tirith when Éomer arrives with the escort for King Theoden's funeral procession. On July 18th, 1419, we get the very brief scene between Éomer and Gimli in which they settle their argument about whether Galadriel or Arwen is more beautiful. Gimli gets to say, quote, "You have chosen the evening, but my love is given to the morning, and my heart forebodes that soon it will pass away forever." End quote. In the real world, meanwhile, this week's Tolkien news has been dominated by a really great piece in PC Gamer, of all places, written by Andy Chalk, who describes the events of the Great Hobbit run in Lord of the Rings Online, the multiplayer role-playing game. The Twitch streamer Burke Black coordinated more than 150 players, all low-level hobbits, on a 6-hour dash across Middle-earth to Mount Doom, which ends with between 40 and 50 overwhelmed hobbits getting lost, and then finally deciding that their accomplishment was good enough and leaping into the lava. It was at least as successful as Frodo and Sam's journey to Mount Doom, for sure. It's fantastic that Lotro, which was launched in 2007, is still such a vibrant game. I have played it a little bit, but not for 7 or 8 years at this point. I was a World of Warcraft guy for my sins, and you can really only lose your life to one gigantic online role-playing game. But had I whirled enough in time, I would definitely jump back into Lotro at this point. In academic news, the collection Queer Approaches to Tolkien Essays on the Many Paths to Middle-earth, edited by Robin Reed and Christopher Vaccaro and Stephen Yandell, is now available for pre-order from McFarland, and it looks like it's going to be a fantastic exploration of an underexplored part of the critical response to Tolkien's work. The link to that also in the show notes. I have been meaning to read Tom Hillman's book from last year, Pity, Power, and Tolkien's Ring, but I'm afraid I haven't got around to it. But I did just read his new paper, The Tides of Time, The Tides of Fate, and the Power of Song, available from the Journal of Tolkien Research. A link to that PDF will also be in the show notes. It is pretty dense, pretty compact stuff, but luminous and really fun to read too. His analysis of Treebeard's thoughts on Lothlorien and Treebeard's division of the world into either states of growing or fading, with there being no possibility of changelessness, is particularly strong. So this paper is recommended, and if you've read Pity, Power, and Tolkien's Ring, and you think that I should skip it ahead in my to-be-read list and get to it sooner rather than later, then do get in touch and let me know. Finally, to bring this episode full circle, there and back again, all the way back to maps, this week begins the first public exhibition of Karen Lynn Fodstad's original art for the Atlas of Middle-earth at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Published in 1981, Fodstad's beautiful maps remain, I think, the high point for cartographic examinations of Tolkien's work. I recently mentioned Fodstad in an episode of Stars and Swords and how much I loved her Atlas of Krynn from the Dragonlance series when I was in my early teens, and I was startled to discover that she grew up, graduated high school, and graduated college all in the same small town in Oklahoma in which I am currently recording this podcast. I had no idea that she was a hometown hero, but I have adored her work for a long time. I don't think that I'm going to make it to Madison before August 1st, but if you are in the area and you get a chance to see the original hand-drawn pages, then please do let me know. And that is going to do it for this abbreviated first episode of Shire Reckoning. Please take a moment to leave a rating and a review, and do head on over to patreon.com/nextword to pledge your support and to get the link for the first live show, our overview of The Hobbit, on Tuesday. No actual reading for this week, just show up with your passion. That's all we need. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you all again very soon.